the Government of Canada has approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project.
A surprise announcement from the Prime Minister today. Justin Trudeau's government also approving the Line 3 pipeline replacement this afternoon, but rejecting Enbridge's other big project, Northern Gateway. We have a lot more on this story coming up in just a moment. And a Calgary police officer shot and killed a woman in Sonalta early this morning. ACERT says the woman was carrying a knife in each hand and confronted police. It's the 10th police-involved shooting this year in our city, the 5th fatality. And one of the people instrumental in making Donald Trump the president-elect is coming to Calgary in January. Kellyanne Conway will speak to business leaders in our city and then visit Fort McMurray on an oil sands tour. You might recall her face from all those TV shows. She was the spokesperson during the campaign. It's 6 o'clock.
This is CBC Calgary News.
Good evening and thank you for joining us as we go behind the headlines on this Tuesday, November the 29th. I'm Rob Brown in the CBC Calgary studio. On the show tonight, a major development in our province and our city today. Alberta finally gets its pipeline to Tidewater. We're spending the entire broadcast on this single subject today. The president of CAP is going to explain the difference Trans Mountain will make to the industry's growth and job growth in our province. We're also going to look at the political implications of the Prime Minister's announcement today.
And let me say this definitively, we could not have approved this project without the leadership of Premier Notley and Alberta's Climate Leadership Plan, a plan that commits to pricing carbon and capping oil sands emissions at 100 megatons per year.
Prime Minister Trudeau is showing some extraordinary leadership today. Our province has been brutally slammed by the collapse in commodity prices, and it has been a long, dark night for the people of Alberta as a result. Today, we are finally seeing some morning light.
The Premier and Prime Minister patting each other on the back there in Ottawa today after working together to pave the way for a new pipeline to Tidewater. One of two lines approved today. Ottawa rejected Enbridge's Northern Gateway project, which would have carried bitumen from Alberta through the Great Bear Rainforest to BC's north coast. The Prime Minister deeming that project too risky. But Enbridge's replacement of Line 3 was approved. It carries oil from a terminal near Hardisty, Alberta, through northern Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin. But the big news today, the green light given to Kinder Morgan's controversial Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. It will move a mix of oil products from Edmonton to a terminal in Burnaby, BC, where it will be exported, that oil, to markets in Asia. This is a twinning of an already existing pipeline. The president of Kinder Morgan hailing what his company calls a landmark decision on Trans Mountain, saying, quote, "This is a defining moment for our project and Canada's energy industry," said Ian Anderson in a written statement. "We are excited to move forward and get this project built." Enbridge obviously pleased with the government's blessing for its Line 3 replacement program, and just as obviously disappointed that Ottawa will ask the National Energy Board to reject Northern Gateway. In a written statement, that company says this was an important project to ensure Canada gets its resources to international markets where Canadian producers can receive the best returns, benefiting our provincial and national economies. And the leader of the official opposition is decrying the loss of those potential benefits.
We've seen 4,000 jobs disappear, billions of dollars in economic opportunities for First Nations in northern British Columbia. My hope was that every option would be left on the table, and that has not happened with Gateway.
For a look at what this means for the oil and gas industry, we've reached out to Tim McMillan. He, of course, is the president and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and he joins me now from downtown Calgary. So first off, Tim, your reaction to the news that Alberta is getting a pipeline to Tidewater?
You know, I think that's great news. It's something that a lot of people have worked very hard on for several years. And today's announcement, I think, positions us well to see it constructed here in the coming years.
Remind us what kind of difference Trans Mountain will make to industry in our province in terms of revenue and jobs potentially.
You know, the increased capacity, because it's really a twinning of an existing line, will add about 600,000 barrels a day. That's a substantial volume. It allows us to link our resources to Tidewater and potentially have access to new and growing markets around the world. Just that project will create thousands and thousands of jobs during construction, but will set Canada up for success on the upstream for decades and decades to come.
Approval is one thing, though, and we've been hearing for months that this project is going to come under mass protest. I'm just looking at the website, CBC BC, and its headline right there is Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain approval, beginning of a long battle, in quotes, vows BC First Nation. Vancouver Mayor profoundly disappointed by Kinder Morgan. Are you confident that this line will be built? Yeah,
most certainly I am. The federal government came into office a year ago. When they took on the responsibilities, they said they wanted to ensure that the regulatory process, that the National Energy Board process met their high standards, so that if they said yes, they'd be confident in that answer. They put in place an enhanced process, and at the end of the enhanced process, today the Prime Minister said that this project is in the Canadian interest. He said it very clearly, and I think that there's very few Canadians that could question that it hasn't had a thorough, thoughtful, scientific and engineering review.
But in terms of making sure that it is built, so in practical terms, the boots on the ground, whose responsibility in your mind is that?
You know, obviously, if there's people that disagree or don't like this answer, Canada's the type of country where free speech is not just accepted, but it's encouraged. And today, people may not like the answer, and they can and should say so. But the government has a responsibility to approve these projects, and this one now has positioned itself for success.
Trans Mountain approved, Line 3 approved as well, and now Keystone is back on the table with an incoming Trump presidency. If all of those projects go through, does industry here in Alberta still need more pipelines?
You know, our projections, and we put out numbers every June, and we update them. With what's already in construction and in flight, we're going to add another 850,000 barrels a day of capacity between now and 2021. So in fairly short order, we're going to add more capacity than either of the two projects that are currently proposed. We're already full on our current system, and between 2021 and 2030, we will bring on another 700,000 barrels a day. So the opportunity and the potential for Canada is great. These projects allow us to reach that potential. And I think we also have to not just look at the volume, but the ability to connect to new and growing markets, both east and west, as well as our traditional customers to the south. So there's a strategic imperative as well.
Tim McMillan, as we say, thanks for taking the time.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so you heard it there. Even with these approvals, industry may need even more pipelines down the line. That's not something Greenpeace wants to hear. It's calling this a devastating day for climate action in Canada and for Indigenous reconciliation.
You know, there's no climate leadership to be found through building 2 new tar sands pipelines. You know, when you're talking about adding 30 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, that's massive, and that's every year for the life of these projects.
Make no mistake, this is a major political development involving 2 politicians who are still relatively new to the job and one who really needed this headline. Dwayne Bratt is here to talk about the impact this Trans Mountain decision in particular could have on provincial politics. He, of course, a political scientist with Mount Royal University. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Good evening. Could you characterize this as anything other than a big win for Rachel Notley?
Absolutely, it's a big win. Not only was the pipeline approved, but the way that Trudeau did it, where he outlined the climate strategy that Rachel Notley released last year about putting a price on carbon and a coal phase out, paved the way for today's announcement.
So how is this going to play out in the legislature?
I mean, there's going to be some criticism, because that's what official opposition parties do. But the criticism will be, well, we'll have to wait and see until the shovel's on the ground, because there's a number of challenges, you know, that Kinder Morgan still has in building the pipeline. But I think this was a win for her.
She has said all along, look, we're trying to do something that the PCs never could do. And that is get a pipeline to Tidewater, and we're putting our eggs in this climate action leadership plan basket. And of course, that means they're going to start taxing Albertans with a carbon tax.
Yep.
Is this enough to mute any kind of concern about that increase at the pumps?
It's too early to tell because A, the carbon tax hasn't kicked in yet. That occurs in January. So it's one thing to talk about it hypothetically, but when you're paying it every day,
Sure.
then you know. And the second, well, this was an important day for the approval and stamping off the NEB's decision. We still don't see a shovel in the ground. There's still a lot of work to be done. So in 2019, if people have been paying that and this is bound up in the courts or there's civil disobedience like what we've seen in North Dakota and there's no progress made on the pipeline, then Rachel Notley is put in a box.
And especially since she said today that she will go along with the federal government's plan to price carbon higher than her plan called for, so $50 per ton by 2022, which means an increase in the carbon tax. Could we read that any other way?
Oh, absolutely it's an increase. But once she set the table for introducing a carbon tax, and remember, she did it well in advance of the Liberal government, then what's the difference? You know, now you're talking an increase and you're talking about percentages. The big move was establishing it in the first place.
Okay, next door, there's a big piece of the puzzle here in BC.
Yes.
It has to sign off on this. There's an election year, you know, for the government there. What are you expecting to see there?
I think you're going to see a very divided BC government. I think Christy Clark was brought on side because prior to this decision, Prime Minister Trudeau had approved an LNG pipeline in BC that Christy Clark really wanted. The second is, while there is opposition in the Lower Mainland, in the Burnaby and the Vancouver area, this pipeline is very popular in the interior part of BC. The NDP is going to fixate on this, but the NDP fixated it in 2013. And it allowed for Christy Clark to win an upset election. Yeah. So I think there's a lot at play going on in BC. She's still going to highlight her 5 conditions, but many of those conditions are tied into what the NEB's conditions are. So I think Clark has already been signed on well in advance of Trudeau's announcement, and it will be a political issue, but I think Clark thinks, just as in 2013, this is an issue she can win on in the province.
One of those conditions is fair share, and I'm told that negotiations are already underway with Kinder Morgan in terms of payment.
Yeah.
So that'll be interesting. Quickly, Dwayne, we've got 30 seconds left. Trudeau's handling of this file.
Oh, I think this was really well laid out because he did all the environment stuff first, right? He brought in the price on carbon nationwide. He brought in the coal phase out. He pre-announced the tanker ban. So setting all of this stuff up to then be able to say, all right, I've done the environmental file, now I'm doing the energy file. And he kept saying that this was in the national interest, that this was good, because people were trying to fixate BC versus Alberta. You chose sides and says, no, I chose Canada.
Interesting day. Dwayne Brad, always good to see you.
Okay, Ron.
All right. So there's the political and the industry analysis. After the break, a big picture look at the pipeline debate going forward. All right, the decisions out of Ottawa today may have marked a milestone for this province, but the debate over pipelines, it isn't going away anytime soon. Jennifer Winter is here to get into some of that. She's the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the U of C's School of Public Policy. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So Tim McMillan of CAP just on the show talking about even with Keystone potentially approved, Trans Mountain built, this twinning Line 3, that down the line, industry is going to need even more pipelines. Does that square with your research?
So based on current projections, it's quite possible that Alberta will need more pipelines, but it really depends on what costs are here and what the price of oil does and how profitable it is to invest in the oil sands versus elsewhere in the world.
Okay, all right. So wait and see.
Wait and see, yeah.
But potentially.
Potentially.
All right, so to Trans Mountain, this is the big deal today. And I was just talking to Dwayne Bratt about the obstacles that it could face in British Columbia if the BC government digs in. He doesn't think that'll happen, but there is talk that it may, if it does decide to dig in, refuse to grant permits that Kinder Morgan would need to build this pipeline. Can a government, a provincial government, obstruct a project that the Prime Minister has said is in the national interest?
Well, the pipelines do need these provincial permits, but it is a federally regulated industry, and so the project proponent does have recourse with the federal government to, enable building. I think a bigger concern is potential protests and whether or not the Trudeau government is willing to stand up to opposition in the face of protests and sitting in on pipeline routes, and whether or not they are going to essentially maintain law and order with a project that they have said is in the public interest.
So you're saying that the feds would have to give direction to the RCMP to clear people out. I mean, policing is a provincial matter, right?
Right, but it is a federally regulated industry, and so it's the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that if they say the project is in the public interest, that they act on that. Exactly.
That could make things really interesting. What are you expecting? Are you expecting Trans Mountain to actually be built?
I am expecting at least one court case about Trans Mountain. I think just because it's been approved by the Government of Canada doesn't necessarily mean it will be built, but I think that if it proceeds and if the court case finds in favor of Kinder Morgan, then yeah, I would expect that it be built unless market conditions change drastically.
Who are you expecting the plaintiff to be in that case?
I would suspect that First Nation groups would be the plaintiffs, like in Northern Gateway, and I don't know, it's quite possible that the city of Burnaby might also participate in that court case.
Okay, this is sort of taking our eyes off another controversial project, albeit temporarily, but if there is more capacity potentially down the line that's required, Energy East will come back on the table at some point. We'll start talking about that. Politically, do you think Trans Mountain takes Energy East out of play?
Not necessarily, in that there is support with provincial governments across Canada for Energy East, and arguably stronger support than the BC government has exhibited. So with that political pressure, it's quite possible that Energy East is still on the table.
Quebec could be an issue there, though.
Definitely, and they also have concerns similar to BC, and so it's, it'll be really interesting to see what type of negotiations go on.
Yeah, because Trudeau has a lot of seats in Quebec.
That's true.
Jennifer Woodrow, always good to see you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, she says this may have been Justin Trudeau's toughest test to date. Up next, we're going to get a sense of what was happening in that cabinet room in Ottawa from someone who sat in on that federal Liberal caucus. All right, just to recap our top story, the Prime Minister announcing today that the federal government has made a decision on 3 major pipeline projects. Enbridge's proposed Northern Gateway project, which would have transported bitumen from Alberta across northern BC, was rejected. However, Enbridge's Line 3 plan, as well as Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain project, were both approved. And joining me now is the President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation, Calgary-based think tank, Martha Hall-Finley. Nice to see you in studio.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you.
On an interesting day, to be sure. Now, for our viewers who may not be aware or may not recall, you used to be a federal Liberal MP.
I did used to be that, yes.
So first off, take me in that cabinet room, if you could. I know you weren't privy to the discussions, but what do you think they were weighing there in terms of the implications beyond Alberta's interest? Because there's a big constituency in BC, obviously, that's really concerned about Trans Mountain.
Well, but just to step back a second, this is also really important for Canada as a whole. There are suppliers of equipment and other goods to the oil sands in Ontario and in Quebec and in British Columbia, and so I think to your question about being in the cabinet room, this was a very tough, I won't say threading of a needle, that doesn't do it justice actually. This was a very tough combination of files, there's no question. And I think the Prime Minister today, in his preamble to the announcement, reiterated that the importance of ensuring economic prosperity, important, ensuring environmental sustainability, important.
There's a thread of the needle part.
But there really is an opportunity for Canada to do both. And this decision was a very big part of that. I think there are a lot of people disappointed that Northern Gateway was dismissed. Don't think anybody was hugely surprised about that. I mean, the Prime Minister campaigned on that a year ago. But the bigger challenge now, so in terms of cabinet, it would have been tough. You know, some are not as supportive as others, and even they have some caucus members who have been very vocal against Kinder Morgan, but that's leadership, and I think they've shown some.
Do you think it's his toughest decision to date since he came to 24 Sussex?
Without question, the toughest decision to date. Will it be his toughest decision during his tenure? I don't think so. He's going to have some very tough decisions, including what does he do now? So I just caught a clip of the official opposition, Rona Ambrose, really stressing approval's one thing, but you know, how do we get it built? You know, the federal government actually had approved Northern Gateway. Remember the prior one didn't get built. But there will be protests. There will be people upset about this. And this
do you think it's on the government? It's the government's responsibility to see it built, or is it now incumbent on the company, Kinder Morgan?
It is incumbent on the federal government to stand behind the rule of law in this country. It is incumbent on the federal government to stand behind its decision. But totally aside from that, this is, I think, an opportunity for the Prime Minister. For some of us, we can remember when his father stood up to significant protests in Quebec, and interestingly enough garnered an awful lot of respect. It was tough at the time, but garnered respect even for people who weren't supportive of him for at least having the courage and the leadership to stand his ground. This is an opportunity for the current Prime Minister, and a lot of us are hoping that he takes the view as well. Approval is one thing, but the point is to get this built.
You raised Quebec. There's a school of thought in this city that if he's greenlighting Trans Mountain, that means Energy East won't get the green light because the Liberals have the majority of their seats in Quebec. And even at the consultation stage, we saw a huge protest there. It's more of a headache.
Well, I wouldn't say huge protests. And I would say, I mean, at Canada West Foundation, we just came out with a report with Positive Energy out of the University of Ottawa on, which is a really, I'm biased, but
we
think it's
had the
actually
researcher
really
in
good.
on the show a couple days ago.
That's right. But a deep dive analysis in specific communities, which is really practical and has given us a lot of material to work with in terms of recommendations on how to do things better at the local community.
I'm talking brass tacks political calculation.
If you talk brass tacks political, don't forget that in that case, you had New Brunswick wanting Energy East. There are, in fact, a lot of people along that route that are supportive and that do want to see it proceed. And the question now ultimately comes down, what really is the evidence? What is the national interest? I don't actually think that that decision is going to have to be made anytime soon. I mean, you know, we'll let today settle in a little bit, but even the proponents of Energy East, I mean, we'll have to wait and see if they decide that they want to continue and pursue it, because notwithstanding a government that's shown a willingness to at least use some political capital, we're not sure about the next step, and we're also not sure about what the economy holds.
Sure,
so,
plus Keystone's back in play.
And so it sounds like Keystone is back in play. Line 3 will help, certainly at least in terms of the volume and the cost of getting to the U.S. market. But I think we should not try and prognosticate with respect to Energy East.
Well, that's what I do here. Listen, really interesting time to be talking energy, and really grateful that you could take the time out of your day.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, if you're looking for more coverage of this major day for the energy sector for our city and province, head to our website. Just Google CBC Calgary. Our digital desk is staffed throughout the night, and we're updating that story. That is the news for now. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.